Marcus Whitfield never imagined that opening his door on a stormy October night would change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, betrayal, and the true cost of compassion. What began as a simple act of kindness toward a desperate stranger would soon reveal a secret so dangerous that it threatened to topple the very foundations of power in colonial America. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The candlemaker's shop on Elm Street had seen better days. Marcus Whitfield wiped his weathered hands on his leather apron as he surveyed the modest workspace that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. The autumn of 1774 brought uncertainty to the colonies, and fewer customers meant longer days, stretching every penny. At 32, Marcus had resigned himself to a quiet life of solitude, crafting candles by day and reading by their flickering light at night. The storm arrived without warning that Tuesday evening, unleashing torrents of rain that turned the cobblestone streets into rushing streams. Marcus had just finished his evening meal of bread and stew when urgent pounding shattered the peaceful silence. Through the thick wooden door came a voice breathless, desperate, unmistakably feminine. "Please, I beg you, they're coming." Marcus hesitated. Times were dangerous, and harboring the wrong person could mean imprisonment or worse. British soldiers patrolled the streets with increasing frequency, searching for smugglers, rebels, and anyone who might threaten the Crown's authority. Yet something in that voice, raw terror mixed with fierce determination, compelled him to act. He opened the door to find a young woman pressed against the frame, rain-soaked and shivering. Her dark hair clung to her face, and her simple brown dress suggested a servant or working woman. But her eyes, those were different. Intelligent, alert, holding secrets that seemed far too heavy for someone who couldn't have been more than 25. "Are you injured?" Marcus asked, stepping aside to let her enter. "No, but they'll be here soon." She stumbled into the warmth of his shop, leaving puddles on the wooden floor. "I have nowhere else to go." "Who's following you?" "Redcoats." "A full patrol." Her voice carried the refined accent of education, though she tried to disguise it with common inflections. "They think I've stolen something." Marcus bolted the door and moved to the windows, carefully peering through the shutters. Sure enough, the distinctive red coats of British soldiers were visible through the rain, moving systematically from building to building. Their lanterns cast dancing shadows as they searched doorways and questioned anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in the storm. "What's your name?" he asked, turning back to find her examining his candle-making equipment with curious eyes. "Catherine," she replied quickly. "Catherine Mills." The pause before her response told Marcus she was lying, but he didn't press. Everyone had reasons for deception these days. "Well, Catherine Mills, you can't stay here long. This shop is too exposed, and they'll search for it eventually." He moved to a section of the floor near the back wall, where several loose boards could be lifted to reveal a small storage space beneath. "My grandfather used this to hide valuable supplies during the Indian Wars. It's cramped, but it's hidden." Catherine stared at the makeshift hiding place with obvious reluctance. "How do I know I can trust you?" "You don't," Marcus said simply. "But unless you have a better option, this is what I'm offering." The sound of boots on cobblestones grew closer. Catherine made her decision, carefully lowering herself into the narrow space. Marcus arranged the boards back in place just as the pounding on his door resumed, this time with the authority of military force. "Open in the name of the king." Marcus took a steadying breath and unbolted the door to face 3 British soldiers, their red coats dark with rain. The sergeant, a stern man with graying whiskers, pushed past him without invitation. "We're searching for a thief. Young woman, dark hair, traveling alone. Have you seen anyone matching that description?" "I've been working late," Marcus replied, gesturing to his candle-making station where wax still cooling in molds supported his story. Haven't seen anyone since the storm started. The soldiers moved through his small shop with practiced efficiency, overturning chairs and examining every corner that might conceal a person. One of them lingered near the hidden floorboards, and Marcus fought to keep his expression neutral. "What's your trade?" the sergeant asked, picking up one of Marcus's finished candles. "Candlemaker, third generation. We supply several households in the district. Loyal households, I trust?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Marcus had never openly supported either side of the growing colonial unrest, preferring to keep his head down and his business running. But neutrality was becoming increasingly impossible. "I serve my customers regardless of their politics," he said carefully. The sergeant studied him for a long moment before nodding to his men. "Search the rest of the street. She can't have gone far in this weather." After they left, Marcus waited a full hour before lifting the floorboards. Catherine emerged stiff and pale, but her eyes held gratitude mixed with something else, calculation. "Thank you," she said simply. "Who are you really?" Marcus asked. "And don't tell me you're just Catherine Mills. Servants don't speak with your education, and they don't carry themselves like nobility." She was quiet for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she moved to his small window and gazed out at the now empty street. "My real name is Elizabeth Hartwell. My father was Thomas Hartwell, advisor to Governor Hutchinson." Marcus felt his blood chill. Thomas Hartwell had been one of the most powerful men in the colony before his mysterious disappearance 6 months ago. Rumors suggested he had been secretly negotiating with colonial rebels, trying to find a peaceful solution to the growing crisis. His sudden vanishing had sparked investigations on both sides. "Your father is dead," Elizabeth said flatly. "Murdered by men who discovered he was trying to prevent a war." She reached into her dress and withdrew a small leather pouch, worn smooth by handling. From within, she produced a document sealed with red wax, the personal seal of King George III himself. "Before he died, my father gave me this. It's a royal pardon signed by the king for any colonial who aids in preventing armed rebellion. The pardon extends to their families and grants them land in the Western Territories. My father believed it could be the key to peace-proof, that the crown was willing to negotiate rather than simply crush dissent." Marcus stared at the document, understanding immediately why both sides would kill for such a thing. In the hands of moderate colonials, it could split the growing revolutionary movement. In the hands of hardline British officials, it could be destroyed to ensure the conflict continued. "Why were the soldiers chasing you?" "Because someone betrayed me. I was trying to reach Samuel Adams in Boston to show him that peace might still be possible. But someone in my father's old network is working for the other side, someone who wants this war to happen." Elizabeth carefully returned the document to its pouch. "I've been running for 3 days. They killed my escort, burned my carriage. I'm completely alone." Marcus felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. The simple candlemaker's life he had known was ending, whether he wanted it to or not. This young woman carried more than just a royal document. She carried the potential future of the colonies. "What will you do now?" "I have to reach Boston. But I need time to plan a safe route, and I need someone I can trust." She turned to face him directly. "You saved my life tonight. I'm asking you to save it again." Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, but Marcus knew the real tempest was just beginning. The British would return, probably with more soldiers and certainly with more questions. Elizabeth Hartwell represented everything he had tried to avoid: politics, danger, the kind of choices that could get a man killed. But as he looked at her standing in his modest shop, rain-soaked and exhausted, but still carrying herself with quiet dignity, he realized that some choices were made themselves. "You can stay," he said quietly, "but we'll need to be very careful. And we'll need a better plan than hiding under floorboards." Elizabeth nodded, relief flooding her features for the first time since she had arrived. Neither of them could have imagined that within the hidden folds of that royal pardon lay a secret even more dangerous than they knew one, that would soon draw the attention of forces far more powerful than British soldiers. The king's reward was greater than either could have dreamed, but so was the price of claiming it. As Marcus began to plan how to keep them both alive until morning, the first pieces of a conspiracy that reached from the colonial backwoods to the halls of Westminster began to reveal themselves. The candlemaker and the fugitive had become players in a game whose rules they barely understood, with stakes that would determine the fate of a nation yet to be born. Dawn brought new dangers and unexpected revelations. Marcus woke to find Elizabeth already awake, standing vigil by the window with the alertness of someone accustomed to being hunted. She had cleaned her dress as best she could and braided her dark hair, transforming herself from desperate fugitive to respectable colonial woman. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "They've been watching since before sunrise," she whispered, nodding toward the street, where a single British soldier maintained casual surveillance from beneath the baker's awning across the way. Marcus joined her at the window, noting how the soldier's position provided a clear view of his shop's entrance while appearing to simply shelter from the morning drizzle. "Professional work. We need supplies if we're going to travel," Marcus said, his mind already working through possibilities. "Food, proper clothing for you, and most importantly, we need to know exactly who betrayed your location." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "I've been thinking about that all night. Only 3 people knew I was traveling this route to Boston. My father's former secretary, Jonathan Pierce, helped me plan the journey. Dr. Samuel Morrison provided the escort and safe houses, and Rebecca Ashford, my father's close friend, gave me money and this dress. One of them sold you out, or all of them." Elizabeth moved away from the window, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. What if my father's death wasn't just about stopping his peace negotiations? What if someone discovered what else he was carrying? Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What else?" Elizabeth hesitated, then reached into her bodice and withdrew a second smaller document. This one bore no royal seal, just her father's personal mark, pressed into black wax. "3 days before he died, my father gave me this along with the pardon. He said if anything happened to him, I should only open it when I was certain of my safety." She turned the document over in her hands. "I've been too frightened to look. Maybe it's time." Elizabeth broke the seal with trembling fingers. As she unfolded the single sheet of parchment, her face went white. "Dear God," she breathed. Marcus read over her shoulder and immediately understood her shock. The document was a detailed map of British military positions throughout the colonies, annotated in Thomas Hartwell's precise handwriting. Fort locations, troop movements, supply lines, and most damning of all, the signature of General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, authenticating the information. "Your father was spying for the colonials," Marcus said. "No." Elizabeth sank into a single chair, staring at the map. "Look at the date. This is from last year, before the tensions escalated. My father was sharing British military intelligence with colonial leaders, but not to help them fight. He was trying to prove that open rebellion would be suicide. See these numbers? He was showing them how vastly outnumbered and outgunned they would be." Marcus studied the map more carefully. She was right. The annotations weren't strategic, they were warnings. Thomas Hartwell had been trying to prevent a war by showing both sides the true cost of armed conflict. But someone turned this against him. Someone who wanted war. Elizabeth refolded the map with careful precision. "My father believed there were forces on both sides who saw profit in conflict. British merchants who would benefit from crushing colonial trade, colonial extremists who believed only violence could achieve independence. He was trying to expose them. A soft knock at the back door interrupted their conversation. Marcus tensed, but Elizabeth was already moving toward his candle-making supplies, grabbing a heavy brass ladle as an improvised weapon. "Marcus, it's Jenny Fletcher from next door. I've got breakfast." Marcus relaxed slightly. Jenny was the baker's daughter, a practical young woman who often brought him fresh bread in exchange for candles. But why was she using the back entrance? He opened the door to find Jenny holding a covered basket, her usually cheerful face creased with worry. "There's been soldiers asking questions all morning," she said without preamble, stepping inside. "About you specifically. They want to know about your customers, your politics, whether you've had any unusual visitors." Jenny's eyes found Elizabeth, taking in her appearance with the quick assessment of another woman. "I'm guessing this is the unusual visitor." "Jenny, this is Catherine," Marcus said carefully. "She's a cousin from Virginia visiting unexpectedly." "Right." Jenny set down her basket with a knowing look. "Well, Catherine from Virginia, you should know that Sergeant Williams has been asking specifically about young women traveling alone. He's also been talking to some very unpleasant men who aren't wearing uniforms." Elizabeth stepped forward. "What did these men look like?" "Rough types. One had a scar running from his left ear to his chin, another was missing fingers on his right hand. They were asking questions about reward money." Marcus and Elizabeth exchanged glances. Bounty hunters meant someone was paying well for Elizabeth's capture. "There's more," Jenny continued, unwrapping bread that was still warm from her father's ovens. "I heard from Mrs. Patterson, who heard from the postmaster, that there's been riders going between here and Boston all night. Whatever you're mixed up in, it's big enough to wake important people from their sleep." Elizabeth sat down heavily. The net was closing faster than they had anticipated. "We need to leave today," she said. "In daylight, with watchers on the street?" Marcus shook his head. "That's suicide. Staying is suicide." Elizabeth turned to Jenny. "Is there another way out of this district? Something that avoids the main roads?" Jenny considered this. "There's the old smuggler's route my brother used during the Sugar Act troubles. Follows Beaver Creek north until it joins the Boston Post Road about 15 miles from here. But it means traveling through the marshlands and with this weather." "It's perfect," Elizabeth said immediately. "Difficult terrain means fewer patrols, and the rain will hide our tracks." Marcus wasn't convinced. "We don't have horses, proper clothing, or supplies for a journey through marsh country." "I can help with that," Jenny said unexpectedly. "Both." Marcus and Elizabeth stared at her, and she flushed slightly. "My brother left some things when he relocated to avoid British attention. Traveling clothes, a good horse, camping gear. It's all hidden in our root cellar. Why would you help us?" Elizabeth asked. Jenny's expression hardened. "Because I've seen what happens to people who cross the Crown these days. My brother's only crime was avoiding their taxes, and now he can't come home. If you're running from them, you must have a good reason." Within an hour, they had assembled everything needed for the journey. Jenny had proven remarkably resourceful, providing not just her brother's abandoned supplies, but also detailed knowledge of the smuggling routes. Elizabeth had transformed herself yet again, this time into a traveling merchant's wife complete with appropriate clothing and a believable cover story. But as they prepared to leave, a complication arose that none of them had anticipated. "There's a problem," Jenny said, returning from a scouting mission to the front of the shop. "They've doubled the watch. 6 soldiers now, plus those bounty hunters, and they're checking everyone who leaves the district." Marcus felt their carefully laid plans crumbling. "We'll have to wait for nightfall." "No time," Elizabeth said grimly. "Look at this." She had been studying her father's map again, cross-referencing it with what Jenny had told them about the increased military activity. "They're not just looking for me randomly. See these positions? They're establishing a containment perimeter exactly the way my father's map says they would for a high-value target. Someone is using his own intelligence against us. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Someone who has access to British military planning. Someone who knew about both documents. Someone who was close enough to my father to know his methods. Elizabeth's voice was deadly quiet. One of those three people I mentioned isn't just a traitor. They're coordinating with British command. Jenny looked between them, clearly understanding that whatever conspiracy they were discussing had just become far more dangerous. If they know the standard search patterns, she said slowly, then they'll know about the smuggling routes too. Elizabeth nodded grimly. Which means we're walking into a trap no matter which way we go. Marcus stared at the map, his candlemaker's methodical mind working through the problem from a different angle. Suddenly he saw it, unless we don't run at all. Both women turned to stare at him. Think about it, he continued. They expect us to flee. They're positioned to catch us fleeing. But what if Elizabeth never left the shop? What if she's been here all along, hiding in plain sight? I don't understand, Jenny said. They searched once and didn't find her. If she's still here, they won't search again. They'll be watching the exits instead. Marcus warmed to his idea. We make them think she escaped during the night. Create false tracks leading to the marsh route. Maybe leave some evidence that she headed north. Meanwhile, Elizabeth stays hidden until they redirect their search. Elizabeth was shaking her head before he finished. It's too dangerous for you. When they realize they've been deceived, they'll tear this place apart. Not if we're very careful about how we do it. And not if we have the right kind of help. Jenny added thoughtfully. She was looking at Elizabeth with new interest, clearly recognizing that there was far more to the situation than a simple fugitive hiding from soldiers. There's something you should both know, Jenny said finally. My father isn't just a baker. He's been part of the Colonial Information Network for 2 years now, passing messages between patriot groups. If what you're carrying is as important as I think it is, he'll want to be involved. Elizabeth and Marcus exchanged another look. Their small circle of conspirators was growing, but perhaps that was exactly what they needed. The king's pardon could change everything, Elizabeth said carefully. But only if it reaches the right people. Then we make sure it does, Jenny replied with the quiet determination that Marcus was beginning to recognize as her defining characteristic. As they refined their new plan, none of them noticed the figure watching from the abandoned warehouse across the creek. Someone who had been tracking Elizabeth Hartwell for far longer than anyone suspected, and who had very different plans for the documents she carried. The game was about to become much more complex, and the stakes far higher than any of them imagined. Fletcher Bakery's root cellar smelled of turnips and dampness, but it provided the perfect cover for their clandestine meeting. William Fletcher turned out to be a bear of a man with flour-dusted hands and eyes that missed nothing. When Jenny introduced Elizabeth and Marcus, his reaction was immediate and unexpected. Thomas Hartwell's daughter, he said without preamble. You have his chin and your mother's stubborn streak. Elizabeth stared at him in shock. You knew my parents? Met your father twice. Last spring, he came through here carrying messages between Governor Hutchinson and some moderate colonial leaders. Paid me well to forget I'd seen him. William's expression grew grim. The second time was just a month before his death. He seemed frightened, kept looking over his shoulder. Said he'd discovered something that changed everything. What kind of something? Marcus asked. He didn't say. But he left a sealed packet with instructions that if anything happened to him, I should deliver it to Reverend Clark in Lexington. William moved to a wooden crate, buried beneath sacks of grain. Been waiting for someone to claim it ever since. From the crate, he withdrew a leather portfolio, its surface worn smooth by handling. Elizabeth accepted it with trembling hands. Should I open it now? She asked. Best wait until we're somewhere more secure, William advised. But first, tell me exactly what you're carrying and where you're trying to take it. Elizabeth explained. About the royal pardon and the military intelligence map. William listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled. This is bigger than the colonial rebellion, he said finally. If your father was right about forces wanting war for profit, then you're carrying evidence of treason on both sides. Treason against whom? Marcus asked. Against peace itself. William began pacing the narrow confines of the cellar. I've been watching the patterns. British merchants pressured Parliament for harsh colonial measures. Colonial extremists reject every compromise. Both sides are pushing toward a conflict that will make some people very wealthy and get thousands killed. Jenny descended the cellar stairs carrying a tray of food. Father, there's been developments. Mrs. Patterson says the soldiers are moving house to house now, not just watching the streets. And those bounty hunters are asking specific questions about Elizabeth Hartwell by name. Elizabeth felt ice in her veins. They know who I am. Gets worse, Jenny continued. A coach arrived an hour ago from Boston. Well-dressed gentleman with an official escort. He went straight to meet with Sergeant Williams. William and Marcus exchanged dark looks. British intelligence, William said. They're taking this seriously enough to send someone with real authority. We need to implement the deception plan now, Marcus said, before they expand their search. The plan they had developed was audacious in its simplicity. Marcus would openly leave town on his usual monthly supply run to Springfield, but he would carry clothing and items that belonged to Elizabeth. If questioned, he would claim she had departed during the night, leaving behind some belongings in her haste. Meanwhile, tracks would be left suggesting she had indeed fled toward the marsh routes. But Elizabeth would remain hidden in the bakery's old bread oven's large stone chambers that had been sealed off years ago but still provided perfect concealment. The deception would buy them time to study her father's final packet and plan their next move. There's a problem with your plan, eh? New voice said from the cellar entrance. Everyone spun to find a man descending the stairs tall, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Marcus reached for a tool that could serve as a weapon, but the stranger raised empty hands. Peace, I'm here to help. He looked directly at Elizabeth. My name is Benjamin Crawford. I worked with your father. Prove it, Elizabeth said coldly. Crawford smiled and recited something that made Elizabeth's eyes widen. The morning star rises in the east, but sets in the heart of honest men. That was my father's private code phrase, Elizabeth whispered. Benjamin Crawford, William said slowly. I know that name. You're the Virginia merchant who's been funding colonial printing presses, among other activities. Crawford's expression grew serious. Elizabeth, your father sent me a final message before his death. He suspected one of his 3 closest associates had betrayed him, but he wasn't certain which one. He asked me to watch over you if anything happened. Then where have you been? Elizabeth demanded. I've been running for my life for 3 days. Following the real traitor. Crawford produced a small leather journal. Your father was right to be suspicious. Dr. Samuel Morrison has been selling information to British intelligence for over a year. He's the one who betrayed your escape route and identified you to the bounty hunters. The name hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Dr. Morrison had delivered her into the world, treated her childhood illnesses, been a frequent dinner guest at her family's home. Are you certain? She asked. I watched him meet with a British courier yesterday evening. He provided them with detailed descriptions of you, your route, and most importantly, he told them about the documents you carry. Marcus felt pieces of the puzzle clicking together. If Morrison knew about the pardon and the map, then he also knows about this 3rd packet. Exactly. Which means we need to open it now, before they realize their current search is failing. Crawford looked around the cellar. This location is compromised. Morrison knows about Fletcher's network activities. He'll direct them here eventually, William nodded grimly. Then we moved to the old Whitmore place. It's been abandoned since the smallpox outbreak, and there are passages that connect to the creek system. As they prepared to relocate, Elizabeth opened her father's final packet. Inside were 3 items that made everyone present understand they were dealing with forces far beyond colonial politics. The first was a letter of credit, drawn on the Bank of England for £50,000, an enormous sum that would make whoever possessed it wealthy beyond imagination. The second was a detailed accounting of bribes paid to both British officials and colonial leaders, all designed to escalate tensions toward war. The third was a list of investors in a London-based consortium planning to profit from military supply contracts once fighting began. Your father discovered a conspiracy, Crawford said quietly. People on both sides working together to ensure a profitable war. But why keep this secret? Jenny asked. Why not expose them? Because the evidence implicated people too powerful to accuse without absolute proof, Elizabeth replied, studying the documents. Look at these names. Members of Parliament, colonial assembly leaders, merchants, military contractors. They're all positioned to benefit from prolonged conflict. Marcus pointed to one particular entry. This payment £500 to Zem for strategic intelligence, same initials as Samuel Morrison. Your father was building a case, Crawford concluded. These documents together prove the war is being engineered for profit. The royal pardon shows the crown was willing to negotiate. The military map proves the futility of armed rebellion. And this packet shows who's been preventing peace for their own gain. William was examining the list of names with growing alarm. Some of these people are financing the Sons of Liberty. Others are funding British military operations. They're playing both sides, which explains why my father had to die, Elizabeth sighed. He discovered that the real enemy isn't British tyranny or colonial rebellion. It's the people profiting from the conflict itself. Crawford nodded. And now they know you have evidence that could expose everything. They'll stop at nothing to silence you. A distant shout from the street above made everyone freeze. Jenny crept up the cellar stairs and returned moments later. With urgent news, soldiers are surrounding the bakery. At least a dozen, plus those bounty hunters. And there's a carriage, fancy one with official markings. Morrison, Crawford said grimly. He's guiding them personally. Elizabeth clutched the documents to her chest. We're trapped. Not necessarily. William moved to what appeared to be a solid stone wall at the back of the cellar. When he pressed a particular stone, a section swung inward to reveal a narrow passage, emergency tunnel, connected to the old mill foundation by the creek. Where does it lead? Marcus asked. Eventually to Whitmore Place, but there are several branches. The problem is, once we're in there, we're committed. The tunnel system is like a maze, easy to get lost, and if they flood it from the creek, the sound of boots on the bakery floor above decided for them. One by one, they squeezed through the hidden entrance, with William carefully replacing the stone mechanism behind them. The tunnel was narrow, forcing them to move single file through absolute darkness. Crawford led with a small lantern, its flame creating dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. Elizabeth followed, then Marcus, with Jenny and William bringing up the rear. These passages date back to the French and Indian War, William whispered. As they moved, my grandfather helped dig them when the town expected an attack. Never thought they'd be used to hide from our own government. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they reached a junction where 3 tunnels branched in different directions. Crawford paused, consulting a crude map by lantern light. Left leads to the mill foundation, closest to the surface but most likely to be discovered. Center goes deeper, but connects to natural caves that extend for miles. Right leads to the Whitmore Place, but passes directly under the main road. Before anyone could decide, the sound of rushing water echoed from behind them. "They've found the entrance," William said grimly. "Someone who knows these tunnels is directing them. They're flooding the passage to force us out." Elizabeth looked at the three choices, each representing a different gamble with their lives. The documents she carried could change history, but only if they survived to deliver them. "The caves," she decided. "If we're going to hide, let's make sure we can't be found." As they plunged deeper into the underground labyrinth, none of them realized that Dr. Samuel Morrison was already waiting in the natural cave system, having used his knowledge of the town's hidden passages to set the perfect trap. The hunter had become the hunted. But the game was far from over. The natural cave system beneath the town stretched far beyond anything William Fletcher had described. As their small group descended deeper into the limestone passages, the air grew thick with moisture, and the sound of their footsteps echoed strangely in the darkness. Crawford's lantern cast wild shadows on walls marked with mineral deposits that sparkled like hidden treasures. "These formations are ancient," Marcus observed, running his hand along a smooth section of stone. "This whole area must be honeycombed with passages." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Elizabeth replied. But her voice carried new tension. During their underground journey, she had been studying the documents with increasing alarm. "Crawford, look at this entry from my father's financial records. The payment to BC for security arrangements." Crawford examined the notation by lantern light, his face growing pale. "Your father was thorough in his documentation." "Too thorough," Elizabeth said coldly. "BC Benjamin Crawford. You've been taking money from the same consortium you claim to be fighting." The accusation hung in the cave air like a physical presence. Jenny and William moved instinctively closer to Marcus, while Crawford slowly straightened to his full height. "You don't understand the complexities. I understand that you've been playing multiple sides," Elizabeth interrupted. "The question is whether you're here to help me or capture me." Crawford's hand moved toward his coat, but Marcus was faster, grabbing a loose piece of limestone and stepping between Crawford and Elizabeth. "Let's all stay calm," Marcus said. "Crawford, explain the payment." "Your father hired me to investigate the consortium from the inside," Crawford said carefully. "Yes, I took their money, but only to gather intelligence about their operations. The evidence I collected is what convinced him to compile those documents." "Prove it," William demanded. Crawford reached slowly into his coat and withdrew a second journal, this one bound in red leather. "These are my real records. Dates, locations, conversations with consortium members. Your father and I were working together to expose them." Elizabeth studied the journal, cross-referencing dates and details with her father's notes. Gradually, her posture relaxed. "The handwriting matches correspondence I've seen," she admitted. "But that doesn't explain why you disappeared for 3 days while I was being hunted." "Because I was tracking down the consortium's operational center," Crawford replied. "They're not just financing the conflict, they're actively managing it. There's a facility hidden in the old iron works outside Springfield where they coordinate intelligence, plan provocations, and arrange supply contracts for both sides." Jenny looked up from where she had been listening at the tunnel entrance behind them. The water stopped rising. "Either they've given up flooding the passages, or they've found another way to reach us." William nodded grimly. "Morrison knows these caves. His grandfather was one of the men who mapped them during the Indian Wars. If he's guiding the search, then we need to move faster than they expect," Elizabeth said. "Crawford, how far is this Iron Works facility?" 12 miles northeast." "But Elizabeth, you can't seriously be considering." "I'm considering ending this." Elizabeth's voice carried a steel that reminded Marcus of her father's reputation for determination. "These documents prove a conspiracy to engineer war for profit. But proof means nothing if it never reaches the right people." "The right people being?" "Both sides simultaneously." Elizabeth began pacing the narrow confines of the cave chamber they had reached. "Think about it. The royal pardon proves king. George was willing to negotiate. The military intelligence shows colonial leaders the true cost of rebellion. And these financial records expose the real enemy manipulating both sides. Marcus saw where her logic was leading. You want to prevent the war by revealing the conspiracy to profit from it. Exactly. But first, we need more evidence than just documents. We need to catch them in the act. Crawford shook his head. The Ironworks facility is heavily guarded. Getting inside would require. Getting inside is exactly what we're going to do, Elizabeth interrupted, but not the way they expect. Over the next hour, as they made their way through increasingly complex cave passages, Elizabeth outlined a plan that was audacious in its scope. Using Crawford's insider knowledge and the documents as bait, they would infiltrate the Ironworks during a scheduled consortium meeting. But instead of trying to steal more evidence, they would ensure that representatives from both British command and colonial leadership arrived simultaneously to witness the conspiracy firsthand. You're talking about coordinating the movements of people who consider each other enemies, William pointed out, which is exactly why it might work, Jenny added. Neither side will expect the other to be there. As they debated details, the sound of voices echoed from somewhere in the cave system behind them. Morrison's search party had found their trail. How much further to the surface? Marcus asked. There's an exit about a quarter-mile ahead, William replied. Comes up in the ruins of the old church cemetery. Problem is, it's completely exposed, no cover if they're watching. Then we create a diversion, Crawford said. I'll double back and lead them away from your route. Elizabeth grabbed his arm. That's suicide. Morrison knows you're helping me now. Maybe, but I owe your father that much. Crawford handed her his red journal. Everything you need to know about the consortium's operations is in there. Names, locations, schedules. Before anyone could stop him, Crawford had disappeared back into the darkness, his lantern creating a moving beacon that drew the pursuing voices away from their position. The remaining four pressed forward, through passages that grew increasingly narrow. Eventually, they reached a vertical shaft with crude handholds carved into the stone walls. Moonlight filtered down from above, indicating they had reached the cemetery exit. Marcus climbed first, emerging among weathered headstones under a sky filled with racing clouds. The town lay spread below them, dotted with the lights of search parties still combing the streets. But their elevated position also revealed something else: torches moving in formation toward the Ironworks facility. They're already mobilizing, he called down softly. Elizabeth climbed up beside him, followed by Jenny and William. As they oriented themselves, Elizabeth studied Crawford's journal by moonlight. According to this, there's a consortium meeting scheduled for tomorrow night. Representatives from London banks, colonial merchants, and military contractors. They're planning to finalize contracts for a 5-year conflict. 5 years? Jenny whispered. They're planning for the war to last 5 years? Longer conflicts mean more profit, William said grimly. Weapons, supplies, reconstruction contracts afterward. They've calculated the optimal duration for maximum return on investment. Elizabeth closed the journal with determination. Then we stop them tomorrow night. But first, we need allies. I might know someone, William said. There's a loyalist merchant in Springfield, Richard Townsend. He's been growing suspicious about some of the military contracts he's been asked to bid on. If we can convince him that British interests are being manipulated. And I know someone on the colonial side, Jenny added. My brother's been working with Samuel Adams's network. If we can get word to him about the evidence. Marcus looked between them. You're talking about bringing together people who've been moving toward war for months. What makes you think they'll listen? Because, Elizabeth said, pulling out the letter of credit for £50,000. We're going to offer them something more valuable than war. We're going to offer them the truth, backed by enough money to make it worth their while to listen. The plan they developed over the next several hours was complex but achievable. William would contact Townsend through established loyalist channels, claiming to have discovered irregularities in military supply contracts. Jenny would reach her brother's network with intelligence about British troop movements that seemed too convenient to be accidental. Both messages would include hints about a larger conspiracy that could only be explained in person. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and Marcus would conduct reconnaissance on the Iron Works facility, using Crawford's information to map guard positions and identify the best approach routes. "What about Crawford?" Marcus asked as they prepared to separate. "He'll either meet us at the Iron Works or he won't," Elizabeth said practically. "We can't wait to find out." As dawn approached, they made their way down from the cemetery using a path that skirted the main search areas. The town below was quieter now, with only occasional patrols still maintaining their watch. But Elizabeth knew the calm was deceptive. Morrison would be regrouping, probably planning a more systematic approach for daylight hours. The Iron Works facility proved to be larger and more complex than Crawford's journal had indicated. Built into a natural valley with high stone walls and multiple buildings, it had clearly been chosen for both its defensibility and its isolation. Smoke rose from several chimneys, indicating ongoing operations despite the early hour. "Look at the road access," Marcus pointed out. "Only one main entrance, but there are service paths that connect to the river transport system." Elizabeth studied the layout through a small brass telescope she had found among Crawford's supplies. "The main building has windows on the upper floor. If we could get inside during the meeting, we'd have direct evidence of the conspiracy in action." Marcus finished. As they watched, a familiar figure emerged from the main building. Even at a distance, Dr. Samuel Morrison was unmistakable, his movements purposeful as he directed workers loading supplies onto river barges. "He's not just providing intelligence," Elizabeth realized. "He's actively managing operations." "Which means he'll be at tonight's meeting," Marcus concluded. "Perfect. We'll need someone inside to identify all the participants." Elizabeth lowered the telescope with a grim smile. Dr. Morrison just volunteered. As they made their way back toward town to rendezvous with William and Jenny, neither of them noticed the rider watching from the opposite ridge. Someone who had been tracking their movements since they left the caves, and who had very different plans for the evening's events at the Iron Works. The game was entering its final phase, but the players had yet to realize that the rules were about to change completely. The abandoned windmill on the outskirts of Springfield had become their temporary headquarters by midday. Elizabeth spread Crawford's intelligence across a makeshift table while Marcus kept watch from the upper level. The documents revealed a conspiracy more sophisticated than any of them had imagined. The consortium had been manipulating colonial tensions for over 2 years, carefully orchestrating incidents designed to escalate toward inevitable conflict. "Look at these dates," Elizabeth said as William and Jenny returned from their separate missions. "The Boston Tea Party, the Gaspee incident, even some of the tax protests, they all coincide with consortium planning meetings." Jenny set down a satchel of supplies she had gathered. "My brother's contact was very interested in what I had to say. Captain Nathan Phillips will be at the Iron Works tonight, but he's bringing 3 armed men with him. He doesn't trust British merchants any more than we do." "Townsend agreed to meet as well," William reported. "But he's suspicious about the whole arrangement. Wants to know why a baker's daughter would have access to military intelligence." "What did you tell him?" "The truth that we've discovered evidence of fraud that affects both sides." William pulled out a letter bearing an official seal. "He's authorized to negotiate on behalf of loyalist merchants, but he's also bringing Captain Morrison's superior, Colonel James Whitmore." Elizabeth felt her blood chill. "Morrison's superior will be there. Is that a problem?" "It could be perfect," Elizabeth said slowly, studying Crawford's notes about military command structure. "If Morrison's corruption goes high enough to involve His commanding officer, we might catch them both. But if Whitmore is clean, then we have a British officer who can verify the evidence against Morrison. Marcus finished, climbing down from his watchpost. Either way, we get credible witnesses. As afternoon turned to evening, they refined their infiltration plan. The Iron Works facility would be hosting the consortium meeting in its main conference building, while guards maintained perimeter security. Elizabeth and Marcus would enter through the river access tunnels that connected to the building's foundation, positioning themselves to observe and document the meeting. William and Jenny would remain outside as lookouts and emergency contacts for the arriving military representatives. "What if Crawford doesn't show?" Jenny asked. "Then we proceed without him," Elizabeth replied, but Marcus noticed the worry in her eyes. Crawford had been gone for over 12 hours, and the sounds of systematic searching had continued throughout the day. As twilight deepened, they made their way to the Iron Works through wooded paths that avoided the main roads. The facility buzzed with activity torches lined the walls. Guards patrolled in organized patterns, and elegant carriages arrived at regular intervals. Through telescope observation, they counted at least 20 well-dressed individuals entering the main building. "The consortium membership is larger than Crawford indicated," Marcus observed. "Or they've called in additional investors for tonight's meeting." Elizabeth replied grimly. The river access proved more challenging than anticipated. The tunnel entrance was partially flooded, requiring them to wade through knee-deep water that was shockingly cold. But the passage led directly beneath the main building's foundation, where crude stairs provided access to what appeared to be a storage cellar. Above them, they could hear the murmur of conversation and the clink of glasses. The consortium meeting was already underway. Elizabeth found a loose floorboard that allowed her to peer up into the meeting room. What she saw made her understand the true scope of what they were facing. The room contained representatives from the highest levels of both British and colonial society. She recognized Lord Percy's aide-de-camp, several members of the Massachusetts Assembly, prominent Boston merchants, and military contractors whose names appeared in her father's intelligence files. At the head of the table sat a man she had seen only once before, Charles Townshend, nephew of the famous politician and reportedly one of the wealthiest men in North America. "They're not just planning to profit from war," she whispered to Marcus. "They're planning to control the post-war reconstruction of the colonies." Dr. Morrison stood at a large map, indicating strategic positions with a pointer. Phase 3. Operations will commence once hostilities reach sufficient intensity. Colonial resistance will be allowed to achieve limited successes to prolong the conflict, while British forces maintain overall strategic advantage. Estimated duration remains 4 to 5 years, with total projected profits exceeding £2 million. "What about political complications?" asked a voice Elizabeth recognized as Colonel Whitmore. "There are still voices on both sides calling for peaceful resolution." "Those voices are being systematically eliminated," Morrison replied. "Thomas Hartwell's death removed the most effective peace negotiator. Samuel Adams and other colonial moderates are being discredited through carefully planned provocations. On the British side, Lord North's administration is being fed intelligence designed to harden their position against any compromise." Elizabeth gripped Marcus's arm tightly. They were listening to the systematic destruction of any possibility for peace. "What about the Hartwell documents?" another voice asked. "His daughter escaped with potentially damaging evidence." Morrison's expression darkened. "Elizabeth Hartwell will be located and dealt with. She cannot be allowed to reach either Samuel Adams or Governor Hutchinson with her father's materials. And if she does, then we implement the final contingency. Both Adams and Hutchinson have been positioned to appear as traitors to their own sides. Their simultaneous elimination will remove the last obstacles to full-scale war." Marcus felt Elizabeth trembling beside him, whether from cold or rage, he couldn't tell. The conspiracy was even more murderous than they had suspected. "Gentlemen," Townshend's cultured voice rose above the others. Let us review the final operational schedule. February 1775 staged attack on British Customs House in Boston, blamed on Sons of Liberty. March coordinated raids on colonial weapon stockpiles, attributed to loyalist extremists. April, a commotion outside interrupted his presentation. Shouts, the sound of horses, and then a voice that made Morrison's face go white. Stand down. I am Captain Nathan Phillips of the Continental Militia, here under the flag of truce. And I am Colonel James Whitmore of His Majesty's forces, also here under diplomatic protection. Elizabeth and Marcus exchanged glances. William and Jenny had succeeded in bringing both sides to the facility, but their timing was creating chaos. Secure the building, Morrison shouted to the guards. No one enters or leaves. But it was too late. The front doors burst open to admit both military delegations, their weapons drawn but not yet pointed at each other. The consortium members found themselves trapped in their own meeting room with representatives of the very forces they had been manipulating. What is the meaning of this? Townshend demanded. Captain Phillips stepped forward, his uniform bearing the simple insignia of colonial forces. We received intelligence about irregular military contracts and possible fraud affecting both British and colonial interests. We're here to investigate. Colonel Whitmore, resplendent in British scarlet, nodded grimly. As am I, these accusations suggest corruption that threatens the integrity of both our operations. Morrison moved toward a side door, but found his way blocked by armed men from both delegations. Dr. Morrison, Colonel Whitmore said coldly, I believe you have some explaining to do. This is preposterous, Morrison blustered. These people are terrorists and traitors. These people, Captain Phillips interrupted, provided us with documentary evidence that someone has been selling military intelligence to both sides while manipulating us toward unnecessary conflict. Elizabeth realized this was the moment they had planned for. She climbed quietly through the loose floorboard into the meeting room, her father's documents clutched in her hands. The evidence is right here, she announced. The room erupted in chaos. Consortium members reached for weapons, guards moved to different positions, and both military delegations trained their arms on various targets. But Elizabeth stood calmly in the center of it all, holding up the royal pardon that bore King George's personal seal. This document proves that His Majesty was prepared to negotiate a peaceful resolution to colonial grievances, she said clearly. And this one, she held up the military intelligence map, shows that my father was trying to prevent bloodshed by demonstrating the futility of armed resistance. She looked directly at Morrison. But these people have been systematically destroying any possibility of peace because war is more profitable than resolution. Colonel Whitmore studied the royal pardon with growing amazement. This seal is authentic. I've seen the King's mark dozens of times. Captain Phillips examined the military map with equal interest. These troop dispositions, if accurate, they show that resistance would indeed be costly beyond measure. They're accurate, Elizabeth sighed. My father died trying to get this information to both sides, so that rational negotiation could replace armed conflict. Townshend had recovered his composure and now spoke with ice-cold authority. Young woman, you are interfering with matters far beyond your understanding. I understand perfectly, Elizabeth interrupted. She held up the financial records. I understand that you've been bribing officials on both sides. I understand that you've been planning provocations designed to make war inevitable. And I understand that you're planning to profit from 5 years of bloodshed while thousands die for your enrichment. The silence that followed was broken by Colonel Whitmore's quiet voice. Dr. Morrison, is this true? Morrison's face had gone ashen, but his eyes held desperate calculations. She's a traitor and a liar. The documents are forgeries. The handwriting is my father's, Elizabeth said firmly, and the seal is the King's own. Unless you're claiming His Majesty is part of this conspiracy? Captain Phillips lowered his weapon slightly. Colonel, I propose we examine these documents together. If they prove authentic, we have a common enemy in this room. Colonel Whitmore nodded slowly. Agreed. This conspiracy, if real, represents treason against both Crown and colonial interests. As the two military leaders moved to examine the evidence, Townshend made his decision. He drew a concealed pistol and pointed it directly at Elizabeth. I'm afraid we cannot allow these documents to leave this room, he said calmly. But before he could fire, another voice spoke from the doorway, a voice that made Morrison stumble backward in shock. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Charles. Benjamin. Crawford stood in the entrance, alive but bearing the marks of recent violence. Behind him were a dozen armed men wearing no uniforms, but carrying the authority of those who served causes greater than profit. Hello, Samuel, Crawford said to Morrison with deadly calm. We need to have a conversation about your recent activities. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Elizabeth realized that the true identity of the mysterious consortium leader was about to be revealed in ways none of them had anticipated. The Ironworks conference room had become a powder keg with multiple fuses burning simultaneously. Crawford's armed men positioned themselves strategically around the room, while Townshend kept his pistol trained on Elizabeth. Colonel Whitmore and Captain Phillips stood shoulder to shoulder, their historical enmity temporarily forgotten in the face of the conspiracy they were witnessing. Benjamin Crawford, Townshend said with cold recognition. I should have known Thomas Hartwell's lapdog would eventually surface. Actually, Charles, I think you'll find that I've been considerably more than a lapdog. Crawford moved closer, his own weapon drawn but pointed downward. Tell them about the Virginia operation. Townshend's composure cracked slightly. I don't know what you're referring to. Of course you do. The systematic murder of colonial moderates that began last spring. Starting with Reverend Mitchell in Williamsburg, then Judge Harrison in Norfolk, then Elizabeth's father here in Massachusetts. Crawford's voice grew deadly quiet. All made to look like accidents or random violence, but all sharing one common factor: they were obstacles to your profitable war. Dr. Morrison had backed against the far wall, his face a mask of terror as he realized the full scope of what was being revealed. Townshend, you said we were just gathering intelligence. Shut up. Samuel, Townshend snapped, but the damage was done. Captain Phillips stepped forward. Dr. Morrison, are you confessing to involvement in assassination? I never killed anyone, Morrison stammered. I just provided information about their movements, their meetings. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, Elizabeth said, her voice cutting through his protests. Because knowing would have interfered with the money you were receiving. Colonel Whitmore was studying the financial records with mounting horror. These payment schedules correspond exactly with intelligence breaches in my command. Morrison, you've been selling British military secrets for over 18 months. But sir, I was working for British interests. You were working for profit, Whitmore corrected coldly. British interests would have been served by ending this crisis quickly, not prolonging it for commercial gain. Marcus emerged from the floor access, followed by William and Jenny, who had entered through the chaos of the military confrontation. The room was now crowded with representatives of every faction involved in the growing colonial crisis. There's something else, Elizabeth said, pulling out the letter of credit. This £50,000 bank draft was my father's insurance policy. He discovered that the consortium wasn't just planning to profit from war, they were planning to use it to seize control of colonial trade permanently. She handed the document to Captain Phillips, who examined it with growing amazement. This is drawn on Townshend's personal accounts, Phillips said, but it's made out to bearer for services to Crown and colonial reconciliation, my father's final gambit, Elizabeth explained. He was prepared to buy peace if necessary. This money was to fund reconstruction projects that would benefit both sides, making war economically disadvantageous compared to cooperation. Townshend laughed bitterly. Thomas Hartwell was always naive. You cannot buy peace from people who profit more from conflict. But you can expose them, Crawford said, which is exactly what we're doing. He gestured to his men, who stepped aside to reveal additional figures entering the room. Elizabeth recognized them immediately: Samuel Adams, the famous colonial organizer, accompanied by Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson himself. "Gentlemen," Adams said in his distinctive Boston accent, "we received urgent messages about a conspiracy affecting both our interests. It appears those messages were accurate." Governor Hutchinson, representing the Crown's authority in Massachusetts, nodded grimly. "I've reviewed preliminary evidence suggesting that recent provocations have been artificially created to prevent negotiated settlement. The presence of both men bitter political enemies who represented the extremes of colonial and British positions sent shock waves through the consortium members. Several began moving toward exits, only to find them blocked by Crawford's men. There will be no departures until this matter is resolved," Crawford announced. Townshend raised his pistol higher. "I'm afraid I must insist otherwise." But before he could fire, Morrison made a desperate move for redemption. He lunged forward, grappling with Townshend for control of the weapon. The gun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as both men crashed to the floor. In the confusion that followed, several consortium members attempted to escape, but found themselves facing the combined forces of British regulars, colonial militia, and Crawford's mysterious operatives. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful an hour ago was collapsing with stunning rapidity. Colonel Whitmore took charge of securing the scene while Captain Phillips gathered the scattered documents. Samuel Adams and Governor Hutchinson, despite their political differences, worked together to question the captured conspiracy members. "The scope of this operation," Adams said as he reviewed the evidence, "extends far beyond what any of us suspected." "Indeed," Hutchinson agreed. "If these records are accurate, we've been dancing to music played by people who saw us as nothing more than profitable puppets." Elizabeth found herself the center of attention as representatives from both sides sought to understand the full implications of her father's investigation. The royal pardon, the military intelligence, and the financial records painted a picture of manipulation that went to the highest levels of both governments. "Miss Hartwell," Adams said respectfully, "your father's work may have prevented a catastrophe that would have consumed both our peoples. The question now," Governor Hutchinson added, "is how we use this information to build something better than what these people were trying to destroy." Over the next several hours, as dawn broke over the Iron Works facility, an extraordinary negotiation took place. With the war profiteers exposed and neutralized, genuine representatives of British and colonial interests found themselves able to discuss their differences without the artificial provocations that had been pushing them toward conflict. The royal pardon provided the framework for negotiation. King George's willingness to address colonial grievances through peaceful means, combined with the military intelligence showing the true cost of armed rebellion, created space for rational discussion that had been missing for months. Captain Phillips and Colonel Whitmore, working with Adams and Hutchinson, began drafting preliminary agreements that addressed colonial concerns about taxation and self-governance while maintaining British oversight of defense and foreign relations. "It won't be perfect," Adams admitted, "but it may be workable. And it will certainly be preferable to 5 years of warfare planned for other people's profit," Hutchinson replied. Dr. Morrison, faced with overwhelming evidence of his corruption, agreed to provide detailed testimony about the consortium's operations in exchange for transportation to a remote colonial settlement, rather than execution for treason. His information led to the identification and arrest of conspiracy members throughout the colonies and in London. Townshend and the core consortium leadership faced more serious consequences. Their trial would eventually expose the full extent of the war profiteering scheme, leading to reforms in both British colonial policy and colonial resistance. Organization. But perhaps the most significant outcome was personal. Marcus Whitfield, the candle maker who had opened his door to a desperate stranger, found his life permanently transformed. Elizabeth Hartwell, no longer a fugitive, but a key witness in the most important political development of the era, chose to remain in Springfield to help implement the new agreements. "I could return to Boston," she told Marcus as they walked through the town where their adventure had begun. "My father's estate has been restored, and I have enough money to live comfortably anywhere in the colonies. But I've discovered that comfortable isn't the same as meaningful." She smiled at him with an expression that contained hope for the first time since her father's death. A candle maker and a political refugee make an unlikely pair, but we've proven that unlikely pairs can accomplish extraordinary things. Marcus looked at the town around them, now peaceful under an autumn sky that seemed brighter than it had in months. British soldiers and colonial militia worked together to maintain order during the transition to the new agreements. Children played in streets that had been filled with tension and fear just days ago. "The King's reward," he said thoughtfully. "What about it? We never claimed it. That £50,000 letter of credit is still valid." Elizabeth stopped walking and turned to face him. "You're right. We could cash it, use the money to start over anywhere we wanted. Or," Marcus said, "we could use it the way your father intended, to build something better than what came before." They made their decision that evening, sitting in Marcus's shop, surrounded by the familiar scents of beeswax and tallow. The letter of credit would fund a new kind of enterprise workshops where former British soldiers and colonial militia could work together. Schools where children could learn both British literature and colonial innovation, and trading companies that served both Crown and colonial interests. The King's reward, intended by Townshend's conspiracy to fund war and destruction, would instead become the foundation for a peace that served everyone except those who profited from conflict. Benjamin Crawford, his mysterious mission finally complete, departed Springfield with his armed men as quietly as he had arrived. But before leaving, he delivered a final message to Elizabeth. "Your father would be proud," he said simply. "You found a way to honor both his courage and his wisdom." Jenny Fletcher married Captain Phillips the following spring, their wedding becoming a symbol of the new cooperation between former enemies. William Fletcher's Bakery became the unofficial headquarters for implementing the Springfield Agreements. As the new colonial compact came to be known, as winter settled over Massachusetts, Marcus and Elizabeth established their first joint enterprise, a candle workshop that employed both British loyalists and colonial patriots, producing light that served everyone regardless of their politics. The woman who had hidden from soldiers in a candlemaker's shop had become the architect of a peace that would change the course of history. The King's reward had been greater than anyone imagined, not gold or land, but the chance to choose hope over hatred, cooperation over conflict, and wisdom over the profitable madness of war. In the end, Marcus Whitfield learned that sometimes the greatest reward comes not from what you take, but from what you choose to give away. And Elizabeth Hartwell discovered that the most valuable inheritance her father had left her wasn't documents or money, but the courage to believe that even in the darkest times, ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things. Their story became legend in Springfield, but more importantly, it became example proof that when faced with forces that profit from division, the simple act of opening your door to a stranger in need might just change the world. The Iron Works Conference room had become a powder keg with multiple fuses burning simultaneously. Crawford's armed men positioned themselves strategically around the room, while Townshend kept his pistol trained on Elizabeth. Colonel Whitmore and Captain Phillips stood shoulder to shoulder, their historical enmity temporarily forgotten in the face of the conspiracy they were witnessing. "Benjamin Crawford," Townshend said with cold recognition. I should have known Thomas Hartwell's lapdog would eventually surface. Actually, Charles, I think you'll find that I've been considerably more than a lapdog. Crawford moved closer, his own weapon drawn but pointed downward. Tell them about the Virginia operation. Townshend's composure cracked slightly. I don't know what you're referring to. Of course you do. The systematic murder of colonial moderates that began last spring. Starting with Reverend Mitchell in Williamsburg, then Judge Harrison in Norfolk, then Elizabeth's father here in Massachusetts. Crawford's voice grew deadly quiet. All made to look like accidents or random violence, but all sharing one common factor: they were obstacles to your profitable war. Dr. Morrison had backed against the far wall, his face a mask of terror as he realized the full scope of what was being revealed. Townshend, you said we were just gathering intelligence. Shut up. Samuel, Townshend snapped. But the damage was done. Captain Phillips stepped forward. Dr. Morrison, are you confessing to involvement in assassination? I never killed anyone, Morrison stammered. I just provided information about their movements, their meetings. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, Elizabeth said, her voice cutting through his protests. Because knowing would have interfered with the money you were receiving. Colonel Whitmore was studying the financial records with mounting horror. These payment schedules correspond exactly with intelligence breaches in my command. Morrison, you've been selling British military secrets for over 18 months. But sir, I was working for British interests. You were working for profit, Whitmore corrected coldly. British interests would have been served by ending this crisis quickly, not prolonging it for commercial gain. Marcus emerged from the web. Floor access, followed by William and Jenny, who had entered through the chaos of the military confrontation. The room was now crowded with representatives of every faction involved in the growing colonial crisis. There's something else, Elizabeth said, pulling out the letter of credit. This £50,000 bank draft was my father's insurance policy. He discovered that the consortium wasn't just planning to profit from war. They were planning to use it to seize control of colonial trade permanently. She handed the document to Captain Phillips, who examined it with growing amazement. This is drawn on Townshend's personal accounts, Phillips said, but it's made out to bearer for services to Crown and colonial reconciliation. My father's final gambit, Elizabeth explained. He was prepared to buy peace if necessary. This money was to fund reconstruction projects that would benefit both sides, making war economically disadvantageous compared to cooperation. Townshend laughed bitterly. Thomas Hartwell was always naive. You cannot buy peace from people who profit more from conflict. But you can expose them, Crawford said, which is exactly what we're doing. He gestured to his men, who stepped aside to reveal additional figures entering the room. Elizabeth recognized them immediately: Samuel Adams, the famous colonial organizer, accompanied by Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson himself. Gentlemen, Adams said in his distinctive Boston accent, we received urgent messages about a conspiracy affecting both our interests. It appears those messages were accurate. Governor Hutchinson, representing the Crown's authority in Massachusetts, nodded grimly. I've reviewed preliminary evidence suggesting that recent provocations have been artificially created to prevent negotiated settlement. The presence of both men bitter political enemies who represented the extremes of colonial and British positions sent shock waves through the consortium members. Several began moving toward exits, only to find them blocked by Crawford's men. There will be no departures until this matter is resolved, Crawford announced. Townshend raised his pistol higher. I'm afraid I must insist otherwise. But before he could fire, Morrison made a desperate move for redemption. He lunged forward, grappling with Townshend for control of the weapon. The gun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as both men crashed to the floor. In the confusion that followed, several consortium members attempted to escape, but found themselves facing the combined forces of British regulars, colonial militia, and Crawford's mysterious operatives. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful an hour ago was collapsing with stunning rapidity. Colonel Whitmore took charge of securing the scene while Captain Phillips gathered the scattered documents. Samuel Adams and Governor Hutchinson, despite their political differences, worked together to question the captured conspiracy members. "The scope of this operation," Adams said as he reviewed the evidence, "extends far beyond what any of us suspected." "Indeed," Hutchinson agreed. "If these records are accurate, we've been dancing to music played by people who saw us as nothing more than profitable puppets." Elizabeth found herself the center of attention as representatives from both sides sought to understand the full implications of her father's investigation. The royal pardon, the military intelligence, and the financial records painted a picture of manipulation that went to the highest levels of both governments. "Miss Hartwell," Adams said respectfully, "your father's work may have prevented a catastrophe that would have consumed both our peoples. The question now," Governor Hutchinson added, "is how we use this information to build something better than what these people were trying to destroy." Over the next several hours, as dawn broke over the Iron Works facility, an extraordinary negotiation took place. With the war profiteers exposed and neutralized, genuine representatives of British and colonial interests found themselves able to discuss their differences without the artificial provocations that had been pushing them toward conflict. The royal pardon provided the framework for negotiation. King George's willingness to address colonial grievances through peaceful means, combined with the military intelligence showing the true cost of armed rebellion, created space for rational discussion that had been missing for months. Captain Phillips and Colonel Whitmore, working with Adams and Hutchinson, began drafting preliminary agreements that addressed colonial concerns about taxation and self-governance while maintaining British oversight of defense and foreign relations. "It won't be perfect," Adams admitted, "but it may be workable. And it will certainly be preferable to 5 years of warfare planned for other people's profit," Hutchinson replied. Dr. Morrison, faced with overwhelming evidence of his corruption, agreed to provide detailed testimony about the consortium's operations in exchange for transportation to a remote colonial settlement, rather than execution for treason. His information led to the identification and arrest of conspiracy members throughout the colonies and in London. Townshend and the core consortium leadership faced more serious consequences. Their trial would eventually expose the full extent of the war profiteering scheme, leading to reforms in both British colonial policy and colonial resistance organization. But perhaps the most significant outcome was personal. Marcus Whitfield, the candlemaker who had opened his door to a desperate stranger, found his life permanently transformed. Elizabeth Hartwell, no longer a fugitive but a key witness in the most important political development of the era, chose to remain in Springfield to help implement the new agreements. "I could return to Boston," she told Marcus as they walked through the town where their adventure had begun. "My father's estate has been restored, and I have enough money to live comfortably anywhere in the colonies. But I've discovered that comfortable isn't the same as meaningful." She smiled at him with an expression that contained hope for the first time since her father's death. "A candlemaker and a political refugee make an unlikely pair, but we've proven that unlikely pairs can accomplish extraordinary things." Marcus looked at the town around them, now peaceful under an autumn sky that seemed brighter than it had in months. British soldiers and colonial militia worked together to maintain order during the transition to the new agreements. Children played in streets that had been filled with tension and fear just days ago. "The king's reward," he said thoughtfully. "What about it? We never claimed it. That £50,000 letter of credit is still valid." Elizabeth stopped walking and turned to face him. "You're right. We could cash it, use the money to start over anywhere we wanted. Or," Marcus said, "we could use it the way your father intended, to build something better than what came before." They made their decision that evening, sitting in Marcus's shop, surrounded by the familiar scents of beeswax and tallow. The letter of credit would fund a new kind of enterprise workshops where former British soldiers and colonial militia could work together. Schools where children could learn both British literature and colonial innovation, and trading companies that served both crown and colonial interests. The King's Reward, intended by Townshend's conspiracy to fund war and destruction, would instead become the foundation for a peace that served everyone except those who profited from conflict. Benjamin Crawford, his mysterious mission finally complete, departed Springfield with his armed men as quietly as he had arrived. But before leaving, he delivered a final message to Elizabeth. "Your father would be proud," he said simply. "You found a way to honor both his courage and his wisdom." Jenny Fletcher married Captain Phillips the following spring, their wedding becoming a symbol of the new cooperation between former enemies. William Fletcher's Bakery became the unofficial headquarters for implementing the Springfield Agreements. As the new colonial compact came to be known as winter settled over Massachusetts, Marcus and Elizabeth established their first joint enterprise, a candle workshop that employed both British loyalists and colonial patriots, producing light that served everyone regardless of their politics. The woman who had hidden from soldiers in a candlemaker's shop had become the architect of a peace that would change the course of history. The King's Reward had been greater than anyone imagined, not gold or land, but the chance to choose hope over hatred, cooperation over conflict, and wisdom over the profitable madness of war. In the end, Marcus Whitfield learned that sometimes the greatest reward comes not from what you take, but from what you choose to give away. And Elizabeth Hartwell discovered that the most valuable inheritance her father had left her wasn't documents or money, but the courage to believe that even in the darkest times, ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things. Their story became legend in Springfield, but more importantly, it became an example proof that when faced with forces that profit from division, the simple act of opening your door to a stranger in need might just change the world. 3 months after the Springfield Agreements changed the course of colonial history, Marcus Whitfield discovered that peace brought its own unexpected dangers. The morning began like any other in their expanding candle workshop, with former British soldiers and colonial militia working side by side. When a coded message arrived that shattered their newfound tranquility, Elizabeth decoded the cipher with practiced efficiency, her face growing pale as she read. "It's from Crawford." The London Consortium wasn't the only group planning to profit from the colonial war. There's a French operation that's been funding colonial extremists, and they're not happy about our peace agreement. Marcus set down the ledger he had been reviewing. Their business had grown beyond anything he had imagined possible. What kind of French operation? Intelligence networks that have been working for years to weaken British power in North America. They invested heavily in colonial rebellion, and our peaceful resolution threatens to eliminate their return on that investment. Elizabeth handed him the decoded message. Worse, they have allies among the colonial radicals who believe we betrayed the cause of independence. The message detailed a new conspiracy emerging from the shadows left by Townshend's defeated war profiteering scheme. French agents, working with disgruntled colonial extremists and embittered British hardliners, were planning a series of provocations designed to shatter the fragile peace and reignite the march toward armed conflict. "They're calling it the Phoenix Protocol," Elizabeth continued. "Destroy the Springfield Agreements from within, then rise from the ashes with a more profitable war than the one we prevented." Jenny Fletcher Phillips burst through the workshop door, her usual composure cracked by urgent worry. "There's been developments." Nathan received word from Boston someone's been spreading rumors that the Springfield Agreements are a trap, that Governor Hutchinson and Samuel Adams were both compromised by British gold. "Compromised how?" Marcus asked. "The rumors claim that the peace negotiations were fake, designed to lull colonials into accepting permanent subjugation while making it look voluntary. Jenny's voice carried the strain of someone who had seen too much political manipulation. Worse, they're saying Elizabeth was a British agent all along, and that her father's documents were elaborate forgeries. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. That's absurd. We all witnessed. Witnesses can be discredited, Elizabeth interrupted quietly. And documents can be questioned if you have enough people willing to cast doubt. She moved to the window, scanning the street with the alertness that had never fully left her since their first meeting. This is exactly what the French would do, turn our greatest strength into our greatest weakness. The knock at their door came precisely at noon, delivered with the measured rhythm of military protocol. Captain Phillips entered with 2 men. Marcus didn't recognize one wearing the simple clothes of a colonial farmer, the other dressed in the fine garments of a wealthy merchant. Marcus, Elizabeth, I'd like you to meet Thomas Paine, recently arrived from England, and Robert Morris, from Philadelphia. Phillips's voice carried new tension. They've brought disturbing intelligence from the Continental Congress. Paine stepped forward, his intense eyes studying Elizabeth with uncomfortable scrutiny. Miss Hartwell, there are serious questions being raised about your activities and the authenticity of the documents you presented at Springfield. What kind of questions? Elizabeth asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Questions about whether a young woman could have orchestrated such an elaborate intelligence operation without significant backing from professional agents. Morris's merchant's eye for detail was evident as he examined their workshop. Questions about why French agents have been asking very specific questions about your whereabouts and activities. French agents? Operating out of Montreal and New Orleans, Paine explained. They've been trying to contact colonial resistance leaders, claiming that the Springfield agreements are part of a larger British strategy to pacify the colonies before implementing even harsher control measures. Marcus realized they were facing a more sophisticated threat than Townshend's crude war profiteering. They're using our success against us. Precisely, Morris confirmed. The French have spent years building networks among colonial extremists. When you prevented their profitable war, you threatened investments worth hundreds of thousands of livres. They're not simply going to accept that loss. Elizabeth was studying a map Paine had brought, her intelligence training evident in how she analyzed the information. These locations where French agents have been active, they correspond to areas where the Springfield agreements have been most successful. They're targeting our strongest supporters. There's more, Phillips said grimly. Dr. Morrison escaped from custody 3 days ago. British intelligence believes he's been recruited by the French operation as proof that the conspiracy extends deeper than anyone realized. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Morrison's escape meant that the most knowledgeable witness to the original conspiracy was now working for forces that wanted to undo everything they had accomplished. What's their endgame? Marcus asked. Civil war, Paine said bluntly. Not the controlled conflict Townshend was planning, but genuine chaos that leaves British North America so devastated that French forces can move in as peacekeepers and establish permanent influence over colonial territories. Jenny sank into one of their workshop chairs. After everything we've been through, we're back where we started. Worse, Elizabeth said quietly. Before, we were fighting people who wanted a profitable war. Now we're fighting people who want a catastrophic one. Morris pulled out a thick folder of documents. This is intelligence gathered by loyalist merchants who've been tracking unusual French financial activities. Gold moving through Canada, weapons being stockpiled in strategic locations, and most concerning maps of colonial settlements that show detailed knowledge of defensive capabilities. Elizabeth studied the financial records with growing alarm. These payment schedules. They're funding multiple resistance groups simultaneously, but none of them know about the others. The French are creating competing factions within the colonial movement, Payne explained. Each group believes they're the true patriots fighting British oppression, but they're really being manipulated to fight each other. Divide and conquer, Marcus realized. But not the British dividing colonials, French dividing everyone. The beauty of it from their perspective, Morris continued, is that when the various factions start fighting, both British forces and colonial moderates will be caught in the middle. The resulting chaos will make Townshend's planned 5-year conflict look like a minor disagreement. Elizabeth moved to their secure cabinet and withdrew a leather portfolio Marcus had never seen before. "There's something I haven't told you." Crawford left more than just that coded message. He also left contingency plans for exactly this scenario. She spread new documents across their work table, detailed intelligence about French operations that went back years before the current crisis. Crawford wasn't just investigating the British conspiracy, she explained. He was tracking French intelligence networks that have been operating in the colonies since the end of the 7 Years' War. The Townshend conspiracy was actually the smaller threat. The documents revealed a web of French operations far more extensive than anything they had faced before. Agents throughout the colonies, financial networks stretching from Montreal to New Orleans, and political influence extending into the highest levels of both British colonial administration and emerging American leadership. "Why didn't Crawford tell us this before?" Phillips asked. "Because the French operation was dormant as long as Townshend's war looked inevitable," Elizabeth replied. "They were content to let the British conspiracy do their work for them. But when we exposed and defeated that conspiracy, we forced them to activate their own networks." Payne was studying intelligence with the intensity of someone who understood its implications. "This explains some disturbing conversations I've had since arriving from England. Questions about whether American independence might be better achieved with French assistance rather than through peaceful negotiation with Britain. Which is exactly what they want people to think," Morris said. "Replace British influence with French influence, but disguise it as colonial liberation." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders again. "So what do we do?" Elizabeth's expression hardened with familiar determination. "We do what we did before. We expose the truth and bring the real enemies into the light. But this time, we're not just dealing with corrupt merchants and military contractors," Jenny pointed out. "We're dealing with foreign intelligence services that have been planning this for years." "Then we need allies who understand that kind of threat," Elizabeth replied. She turned to Morris and Payne. "The Continental Congress, are their members? Who would support action against French manipulation?" "Some," Morris said carefully. "But others might see French assistance as preferable to British rule, even if that assistance comes with hidden costs." "And among British leadership?" "Governor Hutchinson and Colonel Whitmore have been tracking some of these activities," Phillips reported. "They're concerned enough to consider joint operations with colonial intelligence." Elizabeth nodded. "Then we create another unprecedented coalition. British intelligence, colonial leadership, and independent operators like Crawford's network, all working together against a common threat to everyone's interests." Payne looked skeptical. "You're proposing to unite people who were on the verge of war just months ago." "We did it before," Marcus said with quiet confidence. "We proved that when faced with people who profit from conflict, former enemies can become allies." "This is different," Morris warned. "The French operation is more sophisticated, better funded, and more patient than anything Townshend attempted." "Then we'll need to be more sophisticated in response," Elizabeth replied. "But the principle remains the same. Truth exposed in the right way to the right people can defeat even the most elaborate deception." As they began planning their response to the Phoenix Protocol, none of them could have anticipated that their greatest challenge would come not from French agents or colonial extremists, but from someone much closer to home, someone who had been watching their activities since the very beginning, and who had very different ideas about what the future of America should look like. The game was entering a new phase, with stakes higher than any of them had imagined and enemies more dangerous than they had ever faced. The revelation came at dawn, delivered by the last person any of them expected to see again. Benjamin Crawford appeared at their workshop door, but this time he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by Dr. Samuel Morrison, whose escape from British custody had been orchestrated not by French agents, but by Crawford himself. "Before you reach for weapons," Crawford said quickly, noting the hostile reactions around the room, "Morrison has information that changes everything we thought we knew about the Phoenix Protocol." Elizabeth kept her hand near the pistol she now carried constantly. "This better be extraordinary, because trusting Morrison once nearly got us all killed." Morrison stepped forward, his appearance showing the strain of months in hiding. "The French operation isn't what any of us believed. I've been inside their network for 6 weeks, and what I discovered, double quotes," he paused, struggling with words. "They're not trying to restart the war for profit. They're trying to prevent American independence entirely." Thomas Paine, who had remained in Springfield to coordinate with Continental Congress representatives, leaned forward intently. "Explain." "The Phoenix Protocol was never about French control of American territories," Morrison continued. "It was about ensuring that any American independence movement would be so violent and chaotic that European powers would intervene to restore order under international oversight." Marcus felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "They want to make independence look impossible. Worse than that," Crawford added. "They want to make it look like a threat to international stability. French intelligence has been coordinating with Spanish and even some British hardliners to create a situation where American independence becomes synonymous with dangerous radicalism that threatens all established governments." Robert Morris examined documents Morrison had brought from his time inside the French network. "These correspondence records, they're not just planning to manipulate colonial resistance. They're planning to ensure that any successful revolution becomes a reign of terror that justifies foreign intervention." Elizabeth studied intelligence with growing horror. "They've been studying the English Civil War, the recent troubles in France. They want American independence to follow the pattern. A violent revolution that ends in chaos and foreign occupation." "But why would French agents work to prevent independence?" Jenny asked. "Wouldn't a weak, divided America serve French interests?" "Not if that America inspires similar movements in French territories," Paine realized. "They're more afraid of the idea of successful self-governance than they are interested in weakening Britain." Morrison nodded grimly. "The conversations I overheard. French colonial administrators are terrified that successful American independence could spark similar movements in Canada, Louisiana, even the Caribbean. They'd rather have a stable British America than risk the spread of revolutionary ideas." Crawford spread a map across their work table, marked with symbols indicating French, Spanish, and British positions throughout North America. "The real conspiracy involves all 3 European powers working together to ensure that any American independence movement destroys itself through internal violence." "The Springfield agreements threatened that plan," Elizabeth said, understanding her voice. "Peaceful resolution with Britain meant the possibility of gradual, stable independence that other colonies might emulate." "Exactly. So they activated networks designed to ensure that any move toward independence would be so violent and radical that it would discredit the entire concept of colonial self-governance." Captain Phillips, who had been coordinating with both British and colonial military leaders, looked up from communications he had been reviewing. "This explains some disturbing intelligence we've been receiving. There have been weapons shipments to different colonial groups, but the weapons are designed to ensure casualties rather than victories. Defective gunpowder that causes misfires, faulty cannons that explode when fired, supplies that run out at critical moments," Morrison confirmed. They want colonial resistance to be bloody, but unsuccessful. Marcus stared at the evidence accumulating before them. The conspiracy they now faced made Townshend's war profiteering look simple by comparison. So what's their endgame? International intervention, Crawford said. French, Spanish, and British forces moving in together to restore order to a continent that's been deliberately destabilized. America becomes a joint European protectorate, with independence movements everywhere else learning that resistance leads only to chaos and foreign occupation. The implications were staggering. Not only was American independence at stake, but the entire concept of colonial self-determination worldwide was being threatened by powers that saw stable self-governance as a threat to their own empires. There's more, Morrison said reluctantly. The operation has a timeline. They're planning a coordinated series of provocations over the next 3 months, designed to push both British forces and colonial resistance into increasingly extreme positions. By spring, they expect the situation to be so chaotic that European intervention will seem like the only rational solution. Elizabeth was studying the timeline with growing urgency. These dates, they correspond to planned meetings of the Continental Congress and British parliamentary sessions. They're timing the provocations to ensure that both sides make irreversible commitments to conflict, just as the violence escalates beyond control. Can we stop it? Jenny asked. Not through the same methods we used before, Elizabeth replied. This isn't about exposing corruption to reasonable people. This is about preventing international manipulation that extends far beyond colonial politics. Payne had been studying intelligence with the intensity of someone whose entire worldview was being challenged. What if we reverse their strategy? Everyone turned to look at him. They're planning to make independence look impossible by associating it with chaos and violence. What if instead we demonstrate that independence can be achieved through reason, cooperation, and international legitimacy? Crawford nodded slowly. You're thinking of preempting their provocations. More than that, Payne continued, his voice gaining the passion that would later make him famous. What if we create a model of independence that other European powers find more attractive than continued colonial dependence? Morris leaned forward, his merchant's mind immediately grasping the economic implications. Show them that independent American trade could be more profitable than colonial extraction, and that stable American self-governance could be a buffer against radical movements rather than an inspiration for them. Elizabeth added, the plan they developed over the following hours was audacious in scope. Rather than simply exposing the Phoenix Protocol, they would create an alternative vision of American independence that addressed European concerns about stability while demonstrating the benefits of colonial self-governance. Working through Crawford's network, they would coordinate with moderate leaders throughout the European colonies, not just in America, but in Canada, the Caribbean, even India, to develop models of gradual, peaceful transition to self-governance that served both colonial and imperial interests. We turned their greatest fear into their greatest opportunity, Marcus realized. Instead of independence movements that threaten European stability, we create independence movements that enhance it. The execution required unprecedented coordination. Morris used his merchant connections to demonstrate the economic benefits of trade with self-governing colonies. Payne began writing pamphlets that articulated a vision of independence, based on reason and international cooperation rather than revolution and rejection of authority. Elizabeth and Crawford worked to expose the Phoenix Protocol to European intelligence services who were unaware of their own manipulation. Most critically, Captain Phillips and Colonel Whitmore collaborated to ensure that British military forces in America would not be drawn into the provocations designed to escalate conflict. The first test came sooner than expected. French agents attempted to stage an attack on a British garrison that would be blamed on colonial extremists, providing justification for harsh retaliation that would inflame a colonial resistance. But Phillips and Whitmore, working with colonial militia leaders, arranged for the French agents to be captured in the act, with evidence of their foreign backing. Exposed to representatives from both sides, the second test involved economic manipulation. French financial networks attempted to create artificial shortages that would drive both British and colonial populations toward desperation and conflict. But Morris had prepared alternative supply chains that not only prevented the shortages but demonstrated the advantages of intercolonial trade cooperation. The third and most dangerous test came when Morrison's former French contacts attempted to assassinate key moderate leaders on both sides, planning to blame each side for the other's losses. But Crawford's intelligence network had infiltrated deeply enough to prevent the attacks while capturing the assassins with documents proving their foreign backing. Within 6 weeks, the Phoenix Protocol had not only failed, but had become evidence for a new approach to colonial governance. European powers, faced with proof that radical independence movements were being artificially created by their own intelligence services, began reconsidering their strategies. The model developed through the Springfield Agreements became the foundation for what historians would later call the Imperial Commonwealth, a system of gradual transition to self-governance that preserved beneficial relationships between colonies and parent countries while eliminating the exploitation that drove revolutionary movements. Dr. Morrison, his genuine remorse demonstrated through months of dangerous intelligence work, was granted amnesty and became one of the architects of medical cooperation programs between Britain and its transitioning colonies. Benjamin Crawford emerged from the shadows to become an official diplomat, coordinating the new system of cooperative independence that spread throughout the European colonial world. Thomas Paine's pamphlets, refined through their collaborative effort, became the intellectual foundation for peaceful independence movements worldwide. But perhaps most importantly, the Candlemaker and the fugitive who had started it all found themselves at the center of a transformation they had never imagined possible. "When I opened my door that stormy night," Marcus said as they stood in their expanded workshop, now employing artisans from 3 different continents, "I thought I was just helping one person in trouble." Elizabeth smiled, her hand resting on the documents that had started everything. "When I knocked on your door, I thought I was just trying to survive until morning." "Instead, you both changed the world," Jenny observed. Her own life transformed from baker's daughter to coordinator of international women's cooperation networks. The King's reward had indeed been greater than anyone could have imagined, not the £50,000 that had funded their early efforts, but the discovery that ordinary people, acting with courage and wisdom, could reshape the relationships between nations and peoples. Their story became legend not because it was extraordinary, but because it proved that extraordinary things could grow from the simplest acts of human decency. A candlemaker who opened his door to a stranger. A fugitive who chose to trust rather than hide. Friends who chose cooperation over safety. In the end, they had discovered that the greatest reward wasn't what they had received, but what they had made possible for others. And in a world where independence no longer required revolution, where self-governance could be achieved through reason rather than violence, the future held possibilities that none of them had dared to imagine when their adventure began in a storm-swept candlemaker's shop on a dark October night. The door Marcus had opened to help one desperate woman had opened pathways to a better world for millions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.